The late afternoon sun bathed the park in a warm, golden glow, casting long shadows across the playground. Laughter rang out as children ran freely, their sneakers crunching against gravel paths. Amid this cheerful chaos, Jamal stood out, not for his looks or clothes, but for the quiet joy that radiated from his presence. At 10 years old, Jamal's bright eyes and gap-toothed grin reflected the innocence of a boy who had no interest in anything but the simple pleasures of life. Today, those pleasures included a soccer ball and a stretch of open grass. Jamal had been begging his mother, Judge Veronica Monroe, to bring him to the park for weeks. She'd promised, but her courtroom had demanded more and more of her time. Feeling a pang of guilt, she had finally allowed him to go alone, reminding him to stay safe. Jamal didn't mind. For him, this was freedom, an escape from the classroom and the stern silence of his mother's study. He kicked the ball back and forth, pretending to be a famous soccer player. His scuffed sneakers and slightly torn jeans told the story of a boy who loved hard, who played harder, and who carried no burden heavier than a backpack full of homework. But not everyone saw him that way. Officer Grayson leaned against the hood of his patrol car at the edge of the park. The white officer's sharp eyes scanned the park, not for danger, but for anything, or anyone, that didn't sit right with him. It wasn't the first time he'd patrolled this area. And it wasn't the first time he'd spotted Jamal. Something about the boy rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was his shabby clothes. Maybe it was the way he seemed so carefree in a world Grayson had long since grown cynical about. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just Jamal's skin. Grayson had a habit of justifying his instincts. "You can't be too careful," he'd say. "Better safe than sorry." But in truth, his mind was riddled with prejudices he wouldn't even admit to himself. When Jamal's laughter reached his ears, something twisted inside him, a mix of irritation and suspicion. "He doesn't belong here," Grayson muttered under his breath. Jamal didn't see the officer approach. He was too busy chasing his soccer ball, which had rolled near the edge of the park. When he finally looked up, Grayson was standing in front of him, arms crossed, towering like a thundercloud. "What are you doing here?" Grayson's voice was cold, sharp. Jamal blinked, startled. "Playing soccer," he said softly, clutching the ball to his chest. Grayson narrowed his eyes. "Don't get smart with me. Why are you here? You live around here?" "Yes, sir," Jamal replied, his small voice trembling. "My mom said I could come." Grayson's lips curled into a sneer. "Is that so? Where is your mom now? Or is she too busy to keep an eye on you?" Jamal didn't know how to respond. He took a step back, clutching his ball tighter. Grayson stepped forward. "Don't walk away from me, boy," the officer snapped. His voice rose, attracting the attention of passers-by. "I asked you a question." "I didn't do anything," Jamal whispered, tears brimming in his eyes. But Grayson didn't care. To him, Jamal's fear was confirmation of guilt. He grabbed the boy by his collar and yanked him forward. Jamal cried out, the ball tumbling from his hands. The world seemed to tilt as Grayson's grip tightened around Jamal's neck. The boy's feet barely touched the ground as the officer shoved him against a tree. Jamal gasped for air, his small hands clawing at the officer's arm. "Don't you dare lie to me," Grayson barked. "What are you hiding? Drugs? A weapon?" I'm not hiding anything," Jamal choked out, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Please, I didn't do anything." The park froze. Parents and children stopped in their tracks, their faces pale with shock. A few brave souls stepped forward, shouting for Grayson to stop. "You're hurting him," one woman cried, pulling out her phone to record. But Grayson was too far gone. He slammed Jamal to the ground, pinning him with one knee. The boy's cries echoed through the park, mingling with the gasps and protests of the crowd. "You're all the same," Grayson muttered under his breath. "Causing trouble, thinking you can get away with it." Jamal sobbed, his body trembling. "I just wanted to play," he whimpered. From the edge of the crowd, a man in a baseball cap quietly recorded the entire incident. His hands trembled with anger as he captured every second of Grayson's assault. He knew this video would be important, proof of the officer's cruelty. When Grayson finally stood, dragging Jamal to his feet, the man shouted, "Let him go. We saw what you did." Grayson turned, his face flushed with anger. "Mind your business," he growled. But it was too late. The bystander had already sent the video to a local activist group, And to Judge Veronica Monroe, Judge Monroe was in the middle of preparing for a high-profile case when her phone buzzed. She frowned at the anonymous message, opening it out of curiosity. The video played, and her blood ran cold. "Jamal," she whispered, her hands shaking. She watched in horror as her son was choked, slammed, and humiliated. The recording ended with Jamal's tear-streaked face staring into the camera as Grayson dragged him away. The room spun. Judge Monroe's chest burned with a mix of guilt, rage, and heartbreak. She had dedicated her life to justice. Yet her own son had fallen victim to the very system she fought to uphold. Clenching her fists, she stood, her voice trembling with resolve. "No one does this to my son. No one." The hunt for justice had begun. And this time, the scales of justice would tip. Not in favor of the powerful, but in favor of the truth. The air was thick with the smell of freshly cut grass and the faint sweetness of blooming flowers. Jamal Monroe ran toward the soccer field, his laughter ringing like a melody against the late afternoon sun. The park had always been a place of wonder for him. The open sky, the chatter of children, the rhythmic creak of swings. It was his escape from a world that often felt too big, too confusing, and too unfair. Clutching his worn soccer ball, Jamal found a quiet corner of the park. His sneakers, already frayed from too much running and too little replacement, kicked up dirt as he dribbled the ball. The boy's energy was uncontainable, his movements filled with the kind of joy that could only come from someone untouched by life's harsher realities. But even at 10 years old, Jamal knew that joy was fragile, especially for boys like him. In the back of his mind, his mother's voice echoed, "Stay close to the park. Don't talk to strangers. Call me if anything feels wrong." Judge Veronica Monroe was not a woman easily shaken. But when it came to Jamal, her son and her anchor, her protective instincts knew no bounds. She worked tirelessly to build a better world for him, a world where he wouldn't have to feel the sting of prejudice she had endured her whole life. But today, she wasn't there to shield him. Officer Grayson sat in his patrol car, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. The neighborhood park wasn't his regular beat, but he'd been assigned to patrol it after a string of minor incidents, nothing serious. Just teenagers getting into scuffles. Grayson liked to think of himself as the kind of officer who kept order. But his version of order was shaped by years of unchecked biases and deep-seated anger. His sharp gaze scanned the park until it landed on Jamal. Something about the boy's carefree demeanor unsettled him. The boy looked out of place, his clothes too worn, his shoes too scuffed. In Grayson's mind, that was reason enough to be suspicious. He muttered to himself, "Kids like that don't just come here to play." He left the car and started walking toward the boy, his hand instinctively brushing the baton strapped to his belt. Jamal noticed the officer approaching but thought nothing of it at first. He focused on his ball, trying to kick it as high as possible. The sun glinted off Grayson's badge as he stopped just a few feet away. "Hey, kid," Grayson barked, his tone already sharp. Jamal froze, startled. "Why, yes, sir," he stammered, clutching the ball. "What are you doing here?" Jamal tilted his head, confused. "Playing soccer," he replied softly. Grayson stepped closer, his shadow falling over the boy. "Where's your family? Your parents?" "My mom's at work," Jamal said. "She said I could come here." Grayson snorted. What kind of mother lets her kid roam around alone? "You got ID? A phone?" "I don't have my ID," Jamal replied, his voice trembling now. "But I'm not doing anything wrong, sir, I promise." "Wrong?" Grayson's voice turned mocking. "What would a kid like you know about right and wrong?" Jamal began to back away, his instincts telling him something was very wrong. But Grayson was faster. He grabbed the boy by the collar, yanking him forward. Jamal gasped, dropping his ball as the officer loomed over him. "Don't you run from me," Grayson hissed, his grip tightening. "What are you hiding?" "Nothing," Jamal cried, tears streaming down his face. "I'm just playing soccer." By now, a small crowd had gathered. Parents pulled their children closer, whispering in hushed tones. Some held up their phones, recording the unfolding scene. "Let him go," a woman shouted, stepping forward. "He's just a kid." Grayson turned, his face flushed with anger. "Mind your business, lady." But the interruption only seemed to fuel his rage. He shoved Jamal against a nearby tree, pinning the boy with his forearm. The bark scraped against Jamal's back as he struggled to breathe. "Tell me the truth," Grayson barked, You got drugs on you? A weapon? Jamal shook his head frantically, his words barely audible through his sobs. I don't have anything. Sir, please, you're hurting me. The tension in the park reached a boiling point. Several bystanders began shouting, their voices a mix of outrage and fear. He's a child, one man yelled. You're out of line. Another woman, holding her phone steady, cried out, I'm recording this. You'll lose your badge for this. Grayson's grip faltered for a moment, his eyes darting to the crowd. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, pulling Jamal roughly to his feet. He snarled, you all think you can tell me how to do my job? Stay back. Jamal's legs buckled, his small frame trembling. The boy could barely stand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. A man in a baseball cap stepped forward, his voice firm. You need to stop, officer, right now. Grayson glared at him, his hand hovering near his holster. Back off. But the man didn't move. I've got it all on video. You touch that gun, and I'll make sure this goes viral before you can blink. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Grayson's face. He let go of Jamal, who crumpled to the ground. Clutching his chest, Jamal was helped to his feet by a kind stranger, who handed him a bottle of water. The crowd began to disperse as Grayson retreated to his car, his face red with embarrassment and fury. But the damage was done. The videos had already been uploaded to social media, spreading like wildfire. That evening, Judge Veronica Monroe sat in her office, reviewing case files. When her phone buzzed, she ignored it at first, too focused on her work. But when the buzzing continued, she picked it up, her heart sinking at the sheer number of notifications. Opening the first video, she froze. The image of her son, pinned against a tree, gasping for air, filled the screen. Her breath caught in her throat as the audio played, each of Jamal's cries cutting through her like a knife. Her hands trembled. She slammed her laptop shut, grabbed her coat, and rushed out the door, her mind racing with fury and fear. By the time she reached Jamal, he was safe at home, but the bruises on his neck and the terror in his eyes were undeniable. Veronica knelt before him, gently cupping his face. Baby, what happened? She whispered, though she already knew the answer. Jamal sobbed, burying his face in her shoulder. He hurt me, Mama. I didn't do anything, and he hurt me. Veronica's jaw clenched, her tears mixing with her rage. She held her son tightly, vowing that no one, not even a badge, would get away with harming him. This isn't over, she whispered, her voice a mix of sorrow and steel. I promise you, Jamal, this isn't over. And as the night settled over the city, the seeds of justice were sown. For Veronica Monroe, this wasn't just personal. It was a battle for every child who had ever been made to feel small, powerless, and unworthy. And she would fight with everything she had. After the crowd dispersed, the park seemed eerily quiet. Jamal sat on a bench, staring blankly at his soccer ball, his hands trembling. He tried to replay what had just happened, but his young mind couldn't make sense of it. He hadn't done anything wrong, he was sure of it. And yet, he'd been treated like a criminal. He touched his neck, wincing at the tender bruise forming there. It wasn't just the physical pain that hurt him, it was the shame. The way the officer had looked at him, like he was less than human. It made Jamal feel small in a way he never had before. A woman approached cautiously, holding out a tissue. She looked at him with kind eyes, her voice soft. Are you okay, sweetheart? Jamal shook his head, tears spilling over. I didn't do anything, he whispered, his voice cracking. The woman nodded, crouching down to meet his eye level. I know, honey, we all saw. That man was wrong. Her words should have been comforting, but they weren't. Jamal wanted to believe her, but the weight of what had just happened was too heavy as Officer Grayson drove away from the park. His knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. His mind raced, replaying the incident over and over. He could still hear the crowd's shouts, see their accusing stares. The videos, they would ruin him if they got out. But part of him didn't feel remorse. The kid was probably up to something, he thought. They always are. Yet, another part of him, a quieter, more buried part, wondered if he'd crossed a line. He didn't want to admit it, even to himself. But the look on the boy's face as he struggled under his grip was haunting. It wasn't defiance or guilt, it was fear. Pure, unfiltered fear. Grayson shook his head, muttering under his breath, he'll get over it. They always do. But his hands trembled as he gripped the wheel tighter. And the nagging voice in his head refused to be silenced. Judge Veronica Monroe paced the living room of her upscale townhouse, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She had just finished calming Jamal, who was now asleep on the couch, clutching his soccer ball like a lifeline. His small frame seemed even smaller under the blanket, his peaceful face marred by the faint bruises on his neck. Her phone buzzed again, another notification from social media. The video had already gone viral, with hashtags like #JusticeForJamal and #StopPoliceBrutality trending. Her inbox was flooded with messages from colleagues, activists, and even strangers, all expressing their outrage. Veronica clenched her jaw, her hands trembling as she typed out a message to the district attorney. "We need to talk, now." She had spent years fighting for justice in the courtroom, dismantling systemic racism case by case. But tonight, the system had struck her own family. The irony wasn't lost on her, and it only fueled her determination. Miles Clark, the man in the baseball cap who had recorded the incident, sat at his kitchen table, replaying the video on his phone. Each time, it made his stomach churn. He couldn't shake the image of Jamal's tear-streaked face, his small hands clawing at the officer's arm. Miles wasn't the type to get involved in conflicts. He kept his head down, minded his own business, but something about Jamal's vulnerability had struck a nerve. He thought of his own nephew, a boy about Jamal's age, and how easily this could have been him. Picking up his phone, Miles dialed a number. "Hey, it's me," he said when the line connected. "I've got something you need to see." On the other end, his friend, a journalist known for exposing police misconduct, listened intently. By the time the call ended, Miles felt a sense of relief. He had done the right thing. Now, it was up to others to make sure justice was served. Jamal stirred in his sleep, caught in the throes of a nightmare. In his dream, he was back in the park. The sun was gone, replaced by a looming darkness. Grayson's shadow towered over him, his voice echoing like thunder. "You're one of them," the shadow growled. "Troublemaker." Jamal tried to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The ground beneath him turned to quicksand, pulling him down. He screamed for his mother, but no sound came out. He woke with a start, gasping for air. The living room was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of a lamp. Veronica was there in an instant, pulling him into her arms. "It's okay, baby," she murmured, stroking his hair. "Mama's here." Jamal clung to her, his small body trembling. He didn't want to tell her about the dream. It was too real, too raw. But as he buried his face in her shoulder, he whispered, "Why does he hate me? Mama, I didn't do anything." Veronica's heart broke all over again. She held him tighter, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Some people don't see what's right in front of them, Jamal, but that doesn't make it your fault. It's their failure, not yours." By morning, the video had reached national news. Networks played it on repeat, anchors and analysts debating the officer's actions. Community leaders organized a rally, demanding accountability and justice for Jamal. Social media swarmed with calls to action, tagging the police department and local government officials. Veronica sat at her desk, staring at the pile of case files she was supposed to review. But her mind was elsewhere. She opened her laptop and began drafting a public statement. Her words were sharp, unapologetic. "This is not just about my son. This is about every child who has been dehumanized. Every family who has been torn apart by systemic racism. We cannot allow this to continue. Justice must be served, and it must be swift." She hit send and leaned back in her chair, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just her fight, it was everyone's fight. Meanwhile, Officer Grayson sat in his kitchen, his TV blaring the news coverage of the incident. His name hadn't been released yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, some supportive, others not. "You're in deep this time," one text read. Grayson scowled, tossing the phone aside. He tried to convince himself that he was the victim, that the crowd had overreacted, that the boy had been a threat. But deep down, he knew he couldn't outrun the truth. A knock at the door startled him. When he opened it, he found his supervisor standing there, flanked by two internal affairs officers. Their faces were grim. "Grayson," his supervisor said, "we need to talk." That evening, Veronica tucked Jamal into bed, kissing his forehead. She lingered in the doorway, watching him drift off to sleep. He looked so peaceful, so fragile. And yet she knew he was stronger than anyone gave him credit for. Turning off the light, she headed to her study, where stacks of legal briefs awaited. But tonight, she wasn't working on her usual cases. Tonight, she was preparing for war. This isn't just about you, Jamal, she whispered to herself. This is about all of us. And with that, she began to plan her next move, knowing that the fight for justice was just beginning the morning after the incident. Veronica Monroe sat in her home office, the walls lined with books on law and justice. But today, the books seemed to taunt her. She had built her career on fighting for fairness. Yet her own son had been brutalized by the very system she trusted. Jamal was still asleep, exhausted from the previous day. Veronica stared at her laptop. The video of the incident paused on the screen. She couldn't bear to hit play again. The sight of her son's tear-streaked face was already etched in her mind. Her phone buzzed. It was District Attorney Marcus Hayes, an old colleague. Veronica hesitated, then answered. I saw the video, Marcus said, skipping pleasantries. His voice was heavy. Are you okay? No, she said bluntly. And I won't be until this officer is held accountable. Marcus sighed. You know how this goes. Veronica, the police union will fight tooth and nail. It won't be easy. I don't care, she snapped. This is my son, Marcus, my son. If they think I'm going to let this slide, they don't know who they're dealing with. There was a pause on the other end. Then Marcus said, send me everything you have. Let's get to work. Veronica wasted no time. She pored over every detail of the video, taking notes. She contacted witnesses, collecting statements from those who had been at the park. Many were hesitant, afraid of police retaliation, but Veronica's calm yet firm demeanor reassured them. Meanwhile, Marcus began digging into Officer Grayson's record. What he found was damning, a history of complaints for excessive force, most of which had been quietly dismissed. There were patterns of targeting minority communities, reports of verbal abuse, and even a few settlements paid out by the department to avoid lawsuits. It's worse than I thought, Marcus said during one of their late-night strategy calls. This guy's been a ticking time bomb for years. How he's still on the force is beyond me. We'll make them answer for it, Veronica replied, her voice cold. Every single one of them. While Veronica and Marcus built their case, Officer Grayson was busy mounting a defense of his own. The police union had assigned him a high-powered attorney, one known for getting officers out of trouble. Grayson sat in the attorney's sleek downtown office, the walls adorned with framed degrees and photographs of past courtroom victories. We'll argue that you felt threatened, the attorney said, flipping through the case file. The kid resisted. The crowd was hostile. It's a textbook self-defense claim. Grayson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. But that's not exactly how it. The attorney cut him off. It doesn't matter what actually happened. What matters is what we can make a jury believe. Trust me, we've won cases with less. Grayson nodded, but unease crept over him. Deep down, he knew the truth would haunt him, no matter what the court decided while the adults prepared for battle. Jamal struggled to process his trauma. He barely spoke, his once lively demeanor replaced by a quiet sadness. He avoided the park, even when his mother offered to go with him. One evening, Veronica found him sitting on the floor of his room, staring at his soccer ball. Talk to me, baby, she said, sitting beside him. What's going on? Jamal hesitated, then whispered, I don't feel safe anymore. Mama, what if he comes back? Veronica's heart ached. She pulled him into a hug, her voice steady. He won't, I promise. And I'll make sure he can't hurt anyone else. Jamal looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. How? Veronica smiled gently. By doing what I do best, fighting for what's right. The case went to trial sooner than expected. Thanks to public pressure, the courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and members of the community. Outside, crowds gathered, holding signs with messages like, Justice for Jamal, and, End police brutality. Veronica sat in the gallery, her presence a quiet but powerful statement. She wasn't the judge in this case, but her reputation loomed large. Everyone in the room knew who she was, and why she was there. The prosecution opened with the video, playing it for the jury. Gasps filled the room as Jamal's cries echoed through the speakers. The prosecutor, a fiery young lawyer named Evelyn Brooks, wasted no time painting Grayson as a danger to the community. This was not an act of self-defense, Evelyn said, pacing before the jury. This was an act of unchecked aggression, fueled by prejudice and abuse of power. Officer Grayson saw a young black boy and assumed he was a threat. That assumption nearly cost Jamal Monroe his life. Grayson's attorney countered by attacking Jamal's credibility, suggesting that the boy's fear could have been mistaken for guilt. But Veronica noticed something interesting. The jury didn't seem convinced. They leaned forward during the prosecution's arguments and frowned during the defense's. The most emotional moment of the trial came when Jamal took the stand. Veronica's heart pounded as her son climbed onto the witness chair, looking impossibly small under the weight of the room's gaze. The prosecutor approached gently. "Jamal, can you tell us what happened that day?" Jamal nodded, his voice trembling. "I was just playing soccer. I didn't do anything wrong. But he paused, his eyes welling with tears. He grabbed me and wouldn't let go. I couldn't breathe." The prosecutor handed him a tissue. "You're very brave for sharing this." "Thank you, Jamal." When the defense cross-examined, they tried to rattle him. But Jamal held his ground. He spoke softly but clearly, his words cutting through the attorney's attempts to twist the narrative. "I didn't do anything to make him mad," he said. "He just didn't like me." Midway through the trial, new evidence emerged. An internal memo from the police department, warning about Grayson's behavior and recommending his removal from patrol duty. The memo had been ignored. The revelation was a bombshell. The prosecution seized on it, arguing that the department's negligence had enabled Grayson's actions. "This isn't just about one bad cop," Evelyn told the jury. "It's about a system that protects bad cops at the expense of innocent lives." After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. Veronica held her breath as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Veronica closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. Justice had been served, not just for Jamal, but for every child who had been dehumanized by prejudice and abuse of power. Grayson was sentenced to prison, and the police department faced a federal investigation. Policies were overhauled, and community leaders pushed for deeper reforms. Jamal slowly began to heal. With therapy and the unwavering support of his mother, he regained his confidence. One day, he asked Veronica if they could go back to the park. As he ran across the grass, soccer ball in tow, Veronica watched him with pride. Her fight wasn't over, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. Veronica Monroe sat in her living room, surrounded by piles of legal documents and witness statements. The sunlight streaming through the window didn't reach her, not because of the blinds but because of the shadow that had fallen over her life since Jamal's attack. Her usually immaculate office was now a war room. Papers scattered across the floor, evidence pinned to a corkboard. The video of Jamal's assault had gone viral overnight, sparking a firestorm of outrage. Social media was ablaze with hashtags. News channels were running the footage on a loop, and protests were erupting across the city. The world was watching, and Veronica was determined to deliver justice, not just for Jamal, but for every family who had suffered under the weight of systemic racism. Her phone buzzed. It was Marcus Hayes, her ally in the district attorney's office. "Veronica," Marcus began, his voice heavy, "I filed charges against Grayson. Assault, child endangerment, and civil rights violations. But you know the union's going to push back hard." "I don't care how hard they push," Veronica snapped. "We're not just fighting Grayson. We're fighting the system that let him get away with this for so long." Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Protesters held signs that read, "Justice for Jamal," and "No more bad cops." The crowd chanted in unison, their voices carrying through the city streets. Among them were parents, teachers, students, and activists, united by a common cause. Reporters swarmed Veronica as she arrived with Jamal, their questions flying fast. "Judge Monroe, do you think the charges will stick? Do you believe Officer Grayson acted out of racial bias? How is your son handling the trauma?" Veronica raised her hand for silence, her expression calm but resolute. "My son is a child. He deserves to play in the park without fear. Every child deserves that. This case is not just about Jamal, it's about a system that needs to change. And we're going to change it." The cameras flashed, capturing her steely determination. Inside the courtroom, Grayson's defense team wasted no time. His lawyer, a slick, sharp-tongued man named Richard Sterling, leaned heavily on the argument of misunderstanding. Officer Grayson was responding to what he believed was a potential threat. Sterling said, pacing before the jury. He acted in the interest of public safety. Could he have handled it differently? Perhaps, but we cannot convict a man for doing his job. The jury's faces were stoic. But Veronica could see the doubts Sterling was trying to plant. Grayson sat at the defense table, his face carefully blank, though his eyes occasionally flickered with unease. Sterling continued, playing on fear and stereotypes. The situation was chaotic. The park was crowded. Officer Grayson had to make a split-second decision. Let's not forget that law enforcement officers face danger every day. Veronica clenched her fists. It was the same tired narrative used to excuse countless acts of brutality. And she wasn't going to let it win this time. The prosecution called witnesses to the stand. Starting with Miles Clark, the man who had filmed the incident. As he described what he saw that day, his voice wavered but held firm. There was no chaos, Miles said. The park was calm. The only person acting aggressively was Officer Grayson. He grabbed that boy for no reason. It was wrong. The defense tried to rattle him, questioning his motives. Mr. Clark, are you an activist? Do you have a history of attending protests against police? Miles stared back, unflinching. I'm a human being. I saw a child being hurt. And I did what anyone with a conscience would do. Next, the prosecution called other park-goers, including a mother who had been there with her own children. Her testimony was damning. My kids were terrified, she said, her voice trembling. They asked me, Mommy, why is that man hurting the boy? And I didn't know what to tell them. When it was Jamal's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. Veronica watched her son walk to the stand, his small frame dwarfed by the imposing chair. Her heart ached, but she was proud of his bravery. Jamal, the prosecutor began, crouching slightly to meet his eye level. Can you tell us what happened that day? Jamal nodded, his voice quiet but steady. I was playing soccer. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Then the officer came and started yelling at me. I didn't understand why. And what did he do next? Jamal hesitated, his hands gripping the armrests. He grabbed me. He pushed me against a tree. I couldn't breathe. His words hung in the air, the simplicity of his truth cutting through the courtroom like a knife. The defense attempted to trip him up during cross-examination, asking confusing questions designed to make him contradict himself. But Jamal stayed calm. Did you run when you saw the officer? Sterling asked. No, Jamal replied firmly. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Why would I run? As the trial progressed, the case became about more than just Grayson. The prosecution introduced evidence of systemic failures within the police department. Internal emails revealed that supervisors had ignored warnings about Grayson's behavior. Records showed a pattern of excessive force complaints, disproportionately targeting black residents. This isn't just about one officer, the prosecutor declared. It's about a system that protects bad cops at the expense of the people they're supposed to serve. The defense scrambled to contain the damage, arguing that the department's shortcomings weren't Grayson's fault. But the jury's expressions suggested they weren't buying it, though she wasn't directly involved in the case. Veronica was given the opportunity to address the court as a victim's advocate. She stood tall, her presence commanding. As a judge, I've spent my career upholding the law, she began, but today, I stand here not as a judge, but as a mother whose son was targeted, brutalized, and dehumanized for no reason other than the color of his skin. She paused, letting her words sink in. This is not justice. This is not safety. This is a betrayal of the very principles law enforcement is supposed to protect. And it must stop. Her voice cracked slightly as she continued. No child should have to grow up feeling unsafe in their own community. No parent should have to worry that their child's laughter in a park could make them a target. The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Both sides delivered powerful closing arguments. The defense leaned heavily on the notion of reasonable doubt, while the prosecution focused on the undeniable truth captured on video. Jamal Monroe is not just a name. Evelyn Brooks, the prosecutor, said, he is a child who deserved protection, not violence, a child whose innocence was stolen in the blink of an eye. And the person responsible must be held accountable. The jury deliberated for hours, the city holding its breath. Veronica sat with Jamal, her arm around his shoulders. When the foreperson finally returned with the verdict, the tension was palpable. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of child endangerment, guilty. on the charge of civil rights violations. Guilty. Cheers erupted outside the courthouse as the crowd heard the news. Inside, Veronica closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She pulled Jamal close, whispering, "We did it, baby, we did it." Grayson was sentenced to prison, and the police department faced a federal inquiry. Policies were changed, and community oversight was introduced to prevent future abuses. Jamal slowly began to heal, his confidence returning with each passing day. One afternoon, he asked his mother if they could go back to the park. As he kicked his soccer ball across the grass, Veronica watched him with a mix of pride and relief. The fight wasn't over, but for now, they had won a victory that mattered. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to smile. As the trial gained national attention, Veronica began receiving calls and messages from families who had endured similar experiences. Mothers whose children had been targeted by the police, activists who had fought against systemic injustice for years, and even former officers who had left the force in frustration reached out to her. One letter stood out. "Dear Judge Monroe, I watched your son's testimony today, and I couldn't stop crying. My own boy was harassed by a cop last year, but we didn't have the resources or courage to fight back. What you're doing gives me hope. Please don't stop. You're not just fighting for Jamal, you're fighting for all of us." Veronica read the letter twice, her chest tightening. She folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer with others like it. Each one reminded her of the broader stakes of the case. This wasn't just about Jamal anymore. It was about an entire system that had to be held accountable. Jamal struggled in the weeks leading up to the verdict. School became a minefield of awkward stares and whispered conversations. Though his classmates didn't mean harm, their constant questions, "What was it like?" or "Are you okay now?" made him relive the trauma. One day, after yet another curious peer approached him, Jamal lashed out, throwing his backpack against a wall. His teacher, Mrs. Peterson, was quick to intervene. She knelt beside him, her voice soft but firm. "Jamal, it's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel overwhelmed. But you don't have to face this alone." That night, Veronica found Jamal sitting in his room, staring out the window. She sat beside him, wrapping her arm around his shoulders. "You know, it's okay to not have all the answers right now," she said gently. "It's okay to just feel." Jamal looked at her, his eyes filled with tears. "But what if I don't feel brave? Mama, everyone keeps calling me brave, but I don't feel it." Veronica smiled, brushing a tear from his cheek. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared, Jamal. It means you face the fear anyway. And that's exactly what you're doing." While the trial unfolded, tensions simmered within the police department. Some officers privately condemned Grayson's actions, while others doubled down, claiming he was being made a scapegoat. Captain Denise Alvarez, a seasoned officer and one of the few women of color in leadership, found herself caught in the middle. She had been tasked with responding to the media frenzy, but she was growing increasingly frustrated with the department's refusal to acknowledge its own failures. In a closed-door meeting, she confronted Chief Warden. "We can't keep pretending this is just about one bad officer. The system enabled him, and if we don't start addressing that, it's only a matter of time before it happens again." Warden sighed, rubbing his temples. "You think I don't know that? But change takes time, Denise. And right now, we need to focus on protecting the department's image." Denise slammed her hand on the table. "Image won't matter if we lose the trust of the people we're supposed to protect." Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder that even within the system, there were those fighting for change. The media's coverage of the trial ranged from supportive to polarizing. Some outlets highlighted Jamal's courage and the systemic issues at play, while others sought to paint Grayson as a victim of public hysteria. A particularly inflammatory piece titled, "Are We Sacrificing Cops to Political Agendas?" aired on a popular news network. Drawing backlash, Veronica watched the segment with a tight jaw, her hands clenched into fists. The narrative was insidious, subtly suggesting that Jamal's case was an overreaction. But not all coverage was negative. A local journalist, Lisa Carter, became one of Veronica's staunchest allies. Lisa's investigative reporting unearthed additional evidence of Grayson's misconduct, including previously buried complaints and testimony from fellow officers who had been too afraid to speak out. "I'm not doing this for clicks," Lisa told Veronica during an interview. "I'm doing this because the truth matters. And the truth is on your side." The trial had become a lightning rod, dividing the city. Protests continued outside the courthouse, with supporters of both sides clashing verbally and sometimes physically. One evening, Jamal and Veronica drove past a protest on their way home. Jamal spotted a sign that read, "Support our police. Stop the witch hunt." The sight made his stomach churn. "Why do they hate me, Mama?" he asked quietly. "They don't even know me." Veronica sighed, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "They don't hate you, baby. They hate what you represent, change. And change scares people. But I didn't ask to be part of this." Jamal whispered. "I know," Veronica said, "and I wish you didn't have to be. But sometimes, change chooses us, and all we can do is rise to meet it." In a surprising twist, a retired officer who had worked with Grayson came forward to testify. His name was Harold Whitaker, a grizzled veteran who had left the force after years of disillusionment. "I tried to report Grayson once," Whitaker testified. "I saw him harass a young black man for no reason. When I brought it up to my supervisor, I was told to let it go. They didn't want the paperwork." His testimony was a bombshell, corroborating the pattern of misconduct the prosecution had been building. Whitaker's presence in the courtroom was a stark reminder of the institutional rot that allowed officers like Grayson to thrive the night before the closing arguments. Veronica found herself alone in the kitchen, staring at a cup of tea she hadn't touched. The weight of the trial, the public scrutiny, and her son's pain felt unbearable. She pulled out the drawer where she'd kept the letters from other families and began reading through them again. Each one was a reminder of why she couldn't give up, why this fight mattered. As she read, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about winning a case. It was about making sure no other mother had to hold her child the way she'd held Jamal that terrible night. The courtroom was packed for the final day of arguments. Evelyn Brooks, the prosecutor, delivered a blistering closing statement, weaving together the evidence and testimonies into an unshakable narrative. "This is not a case about an officer doing his job," Evelyn said. "This is a case about an officer who abused his power and a system that allowed it to happen." Jamal Monroe is a child whose only crime was playing in the park. And for that, he was brutalized. It's time to hold someone accountable. Sterling, the defense attorney, tried to sow doubt, painting Grayson as a victim of a rushed narrative. But the jury's expressions suggested they weren't convinced. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was charged. Protesters chanted, their voices echoing off the surrounding buildings. Among them were teachers, clergy, and students holding signs that read, "We stand with Jamal." Veronica stepped outside after the day's proceedings. Greeted by cheers from the crowd, a young girl approached her, clutching a drawing of Jamal in a superhero cape. "This is for your son," the girl said shyly. "He's really brave." Veronica's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the drawing. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said. "That means the world to us." The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in. Veronica sat with Jamal, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. The weight of the past few weeks pressed down on her, but she kept her expression calm for Jamal's sake. Marcus Hayes, the prosecutor, sat on her other side, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. The judge, a composed woman with sharp eyes, addressed the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a resolute expression, stood. "We have, Your Honor." Jamal squeezed his mother's hand. His breath caught in his throat. Veronica whispered, "No matter what they say, we've done everything we could. Hold your head high." The foreperson began reading. "On the charge of assault in the second degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of child endangerment, guilty. On the charge of violation of civil rights, guilty." A wave of relief swept through the courtroom. Some spectators clapped softly before being silenced by the judge's gavel. Veronica closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. Jamal leaned into her, whispering, "We won, Mama." "Yes, baby," she replied, kissing his forehead. "We did." The sentencing hearing was scheduled a month later. By then, Officer Grayson had become a national symbol of abuse of power. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some saw him as a symptom of systemic racism, while others clung to the narrative of a misunderstood officer. When Grayson stood to deliver his statement, his voice lacked its usual arrogance. "I made a mistake," he began, his eyes darting nervously to the gallery. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was doing my job." But Veronica noticed that his words were hollow. devoid of true remorse. The judge, too, seemed unimpressed. Your actions went far beyond a mistake, the judge said sternly. They were a gross abuse of power, driven by prejudice, and they have caused irreparable harm. Today, you will face the consequences. Grayson was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with additional penalties for his pattern of misconduct. The courtroom erupted again, this time with a mix of cheers and angry murmurs from his supporters. As Grayson was led away in handcuffs, Veronica felt a bittersweet satisfaction. Justice had been served, but the pain he had caused would take much longer to heal while the trial concluded. The ripple effects were only beginning. The federal investigation into the police department uncovered a troubling pattern of negligence, with multiple officers implicated in covering up misconduct. Captain Denise Alvarez emerged as a surprising ally in pushing for reform. The system isn't broken, it's working exactly as it was designed, she said in a press conference. And that's the problem, it's time we redesign it. Her words struck a chord, inspiring other officers to come forward. Whistleblowers provided additional evidence of corruption, leading to the resignation of the police chief and several senior officials. City leaders announced sweeping changes, including mandatory bias training, independent oversight boards, and a zero-tolerance policy for excessive force. For the first time in decades, the department faced real accountability with the trial over. Jamal began the long process of healing. Veronica enrolled him in therapy, where he slowly learned to process his trauma. His therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Yates, used creative exercises to help him express his feelings. One day, during a session, Jamal drew a picture of himself in the park. In the image, he was smiling, holding a soccer ball, with his mother standing nearby. "This is how I wanted to be," he said quietly. "I want to feel safe again." "You will," Dr. Yates promised. "It'll take time, but you will." Outside of therapy, Jamal found solace in small acts of normalcy. Playing video games with friends, riding his bike, and even returning to the park, though always with his mother or a trusted adult nearby, helped him regain a sense of control. For Veronica, the end of the trial was just the beginning. She threw herself into advocacy, partnering with organizations that fought for police reform and racial justice. One evening, she attended a town hall meeting, where community members shared their own stories of injustice. A young mother stood up, tears in her eyes. "My son was harassed by the police last year," she said. "I didn't know what to do. But seeing you fight for Jamal gave me courage." "Thank you, Judge Monroe." Veronica nodded, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This fight isn't just mine, it's ours. Together, we can make sure no child has to endure what Jamal went through." Her words were met with applause. And for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. The city began to change in tangible ways. The new police chief, a reform-minded leader, implemented policies designed to rebuild trust with the community. Officers began walking the streets, engaging with residents not as enforcers, but as allies. One sunny afternoon, Jamal and Veronica attended a community event at the park. Children played soccer while parents chatted and laughed. Jamal even joined a game, his laughter ringing out like a melody. Watching him from the sidelines, Veronica felt a wave of pride. Her son was resilient, stronger than she could have ever imagined. And in that moment, she knew they had not just survived, they had triumphed. In the stark confines of his prison cell, Grayson found himself alone with his thoughts. At first, he clung to his anger, blaming Veronica, the jury, and the system for his downfall. But as the weeks turned into months, a nagging doubt began to creep in. One day, during the mandatory counseling session, the therapist asked, "Do you think you were justified in what you did?" Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, he was forced to confront the truth. He had acted out of fear and prejudice, not duty. The realization was painful, but it was a step toward understanding, a step he had avoided for far too long. Years later, the park where the incident had occurred was renamed Jamal Monroe Park. A plaque at the entrance read, "In honor of Jamal Monroe, whose courage and resilience inspired a city to stand for justice and equality. May no child ever face the injustice he endured. And may we strive always to build a better world." Jamal, now a teenager, stood before the plaque with his mother. His once timid demeanor had been replaced by quiet confidence. "Do you think things are really better now?" he asked. Veronica smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. They're better because of people like you, Jamal, people who refuse to give up. Veronica continued her work as a judge, but she also became a prominent advocate for systemic reform, speaking at conferences and mentoring young activists. Jamal grew into a passionate leader in his own right, using his platform to educate others about justice and equality. Their story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, change is possible. And while the fight was far from over, they knew they had already made a difference, not just for themselves, but for generations to come. Even after the verdict and sentencing, Veronica's journey was far from over. The backlash against her and Jamal intensified in certain circles. Anonymous letters filled with hateful slurs arrived at her office. Online forums buzzed with vitriol, accusing her of using her position to push a political agenda. One morning, Veronica found Jamal staring at his phone, his face pale. He handed it to her without a word. On the screen was a doctored image of him in the park, with captions labeling him a troublemaker. Veronica's heart broke. She put the phone down and pulled Jamal into a hug. "Baby, listen to me. None of this is your fault. They're trying to scare us because they know they're losing. But we're not going to let them win." Jamal nodded against her shoulder, but his small frame trembled. Later that night, Veronica sat alone in her study, drafting a speech for an upcoming conference on systemic racism. Her words were sharper than ever, fueled by the pain of knowing her son was still paying the price for their fight in the midst of the hostility. Unexpected support began to emerge. Officers within the police force who had stayed silent during the trial started speaking up. One of them was a young recruit named Officer Linda Park. Linda approached Veronica after a town hall meeting, her uniform pristine, her expression earnest. "Judge Monroe, I just wanted to say thank you. Your case gave me the courage to file a report against one of my superiors. He's been harassing minority residents for years, and no one dared to challenge him." Veronica studied Linda, noting the determination in her eyes. "It takes courage to do what you've done," she said. "Don't stop fighting for what's right." Linda nodded. "We're cleaning house, ma'am. It's going to take time, but things are changing." For the first time in weeks, Veronica felt a glimmer of optimism as Jamal grew older. He began to find his own voice in the fight for justice. At a community forum, he stood up to speak for the first time, his hands shaking slightly but his resolve firm. "I was 10 years old when it happened," he began, his voice steadying as he continued. "I didn't understand why someone who was supposed to protect me could hurt me like that. But I've learned something since then. Change doesn't happen because you wait for it. It happens because you demand it." The audience erupted into applause, and Veronica felt tears sting her eyes. Her boy, once so timid and scared, was becoming a leader. After the forum, a group of younger children approached Jamal, asking for his autograph. One of them, a boy about his age at the time of the incident, said, "You're a hero." Jamal smiled, though his voice was soft when he replied, "I'm just a kid who didn't give up, in prison." Officer Grayson struggled to adapt. At first, he clung to his resentment, blaming everyone but himself for his downfall. But as months turned into years, the isolation began to wear on him. Mandatory counseling sessions forced him to confront his actions. And for the first time, he started to question the beliefs that had shaped him. One session stood out. His therapist asked him, "Why do you think you reacted the way you did to Jamal?" Grayson hesitated, his usual defensiveness cracking. I don't know. Maybe I thought he was like the others. The kids who run, who cause trouble." The therapist pressed gently. "And what made you think that? Did Jamal actually do anything to make you feel threatened?" Grayson couldn't answer. The truth was too painful to admit. Over time, he began writing letters to the families he had hurt, starting with Veronica and Jamal. Though Veronica never responded, she kept the letter in a drawer. A reminder that even the most hardened hearts could begin to change. The park where the incident occurred became a symbol of resilience and change. Under community pressure, the city invested in renovations, adding new playground equipment, a memorial garden, and increased security measures to ensure the space remained safe for everyone. At the grand reopening, Veronica and Jamal were invited as honorary guests. Jamal stood beside the mayor as the ribbon was cut, a wide smile on his face. Children flooded the playground, their laughter filling the air. As Jamal wandered through the park, he spotted the plaque bearing his name. He touched it lightly, his expression thoughtful. "This feels weird," he said to his mother. "Weird how?" Veronica asked. "I don't feel like a hero," he admitted. "I was just a kid playing soccer." Veronica crouched down to meet his eyes. "You're right, you were just a kid. And that's exactly why this matters. Because no kid should ever have to go through what you did. You're not a hero because you wanted to be. You're a hero because you are, through it all." Veronica and Jamal's bond grew stronger. Veronica learned to balance her demanding career with her role as a mother, ensuring Jamal always felt supported. Jamal, in turn, found strength in their shared journey, often sitting in on her advocacy meetings and offering his own insights. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching the news, a segment aired about police reform efforts across the country. Jamal turned to his mother. "Do you think we made a difference?" Veronica smiled, pulling him close. "I don't think, Jamal. I know." Years later, Jamal stood on a university stage, delivering a speech as the youngest keynote speaker at a national conference on civil rights. His voice was confident, his message clear. "We can't change the past," he said, "but we can shape the future. And that future starts with each of us." Speaking out, standing up, refusing to back down, Veronica sat in the audience, her heart swelling with pride. Jamal had become everything she had hoped for and more, a symbol of resilience, courage, and hope. As the audience gave him a standing ovation, Veronica thought back to the park, to the fear and pain of that day. It felt like a lifetime ago. And though the scars of the past would never fully fade, she knew they had built something stronger, a legacy of justice that would endure for generations. The story of Jamal and Veronica became a cornerstone in the fight for systemic reform. Laws were passed, policies changed, and communities across the nation rallied for accountability and equality. And at the center of it all was a mother and her son. Proof that even in the darkest moments, hope could shine through.